I went to Vienna to visit a great friend of mine. He is really big on AI, coding, and software, and he owns businesses that use AI. And that podcast is also to come very soon. But while I was there, he introduced me to this friend of his, Matteo. He told me that he also owns a business and he is studying physics, but he's also very well rounded as an individual, with a lot of interests about many topics that I also like and find interesting and talk about. And he encouraged me to do a podcast with him while I was there. We didn't have any of my studio equipment, and we were in a penthouse with 6 or 7 individuals, so during the podcast you might hear some noises from here and there. But we had a very good conversation with him, and it was my first time meeting him. So I had no idea about him or his ideas beforehand. In the last part, we talked a little bit about the philosophy of theology, and I decided to remove that part. The reason is simply because I was not satisfied by the way I answered, how articulate I was in giving out my opinions on the matter, and I think that he would also have preferred to have provided some more clarity in what he said. Since my Christian faith is extremely important to me, and I try to take it with as much respect as possible, any conversation around that I would prefer to be well calculated and articulated. So, with that said, enjoy the podcast. We're here today with Matteo. This is Matteo. Thanks a lot for being here.
Oh, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
You're an interesting personality, to put it. Could you talk a little bit about what you are interested in, what you do, what you occupy yourself with at this time?
Oh, well, I think what describes me in the most accurate light is like I wanted to always be a expert generalist. And by that I mean to have the opportunity to have general insight in like most topics by using my expert opinion on a specific field to actually make general assumptions about how it actually works. And this happened, I think, like 2 to 3 years ago, because I felt, I don't want to call it burned out, but a bit empty because I studied physics and it didn't fully saturate me. Is that the right word? Give me full meaning in what I did, because I saw so many people around me and they weren't really happy. Like they were studying really hard, and it was like physics as a whole is an amazing field and really interesting. However, I feel like especially physics is a bit stuck and it has lost its like internal meaning to a certain way, and it also lost a
How
certain
come?
a certain perspective. I mean, well, after a field is extremely successful, usually a certain period of dread sets in because there's not much change. A lot of people focus more on education, and there is not much more perspective of where actually to develop the field into.
You are also a fan of philosophy,
Mhm.
if I'm not mistaken. Um, how about the intersection of science and philosophy? Because also, if we think about it, science originated from philosophy.
Mhm.
It's a bit of a naive statement to make in that sense,
How is
but
it naive?
in the way that currently this is not the case.
Mhm.
However, when it was first initiated, especially from ancient Greek philosophers, uh, curiosity was the factor, the factor which gave birth to it.
Mhm.
What do you think about this intersection?
Mhm.
Do you think science and philosophy cover different different needs of people?
Yeah, it depends on how you define philosophy. Like, do you define it as a scientific field?
Mm,
Yeah, it has parallelities to physics because philosophy as a field has a certain ought it wants to achieve. However, if you define philosophy more broadly as like an exploration of your own consciousness, I disagree. There is like then it envelops physics as well. And just what I said beforehand in regards to the ought, that physics to a certain extent has lost in a weird way. Yeah,
What exactly do you mean by that? Because I'm actually curious.
you may be familiar with a British philosopher called Hume.
Yes,
So this is the famous
David
Hume's law.
Hume.
David Hume.
Yeah.
Thank you. Don't actually know his first name. Thanks. And yeah, and he made this very astute observation that you can't really ascribe or derive from an ought, so an ought statement, so something should be something, an is statement. So that is the state of the world, right? And well, to actually achieve or like conquer this idea is, in my opinion, a pretty hard thing to actually do, because you have to be actually quite conscious of your own desires and your own needs and your own cravings, and somewhat lose your own greed to a certain extent, and be very emotionally stable to not fall into these traps. Because you're
Which traps?
I mean, your ego certainly plays with you and your super ego, and says, well, that's probably correct because that benefits me, right?
How is that different in physics now than all the previous times?
Yeah, well, everybody wants to be the next Einstein, right? Like carve your name into the annals of history, right? Becoming invincible, becoming a god, basically. Because the superheroes of the like 20th century, they were all scientists, right? Think of Einstein, Gödel, von Neumann. Like all these names are extremely supreme and like will forever be remembered, right?
I can't help though, but to find it very interesting to say at least that at the time where most people are super excited with where quantum physics has like its trajectory pointing towards, and most people in the scientific field being genuinely excited and curious to hear that physics is stuck.
Well, again, let's go back to what it is, or like, for example, you mentioned Greek philosophers, right? Like Aristotle, who made this very important observation of like something being an observer and something being an actor. And that's one of the like cravings that many scientists have, which is like funding, and they have to advertise their own progress, right?
Yep.
And so what they publicly state as their own motivation is totally different from what they, for example, would claim internally or in actual discussions.
I was reading an essay regarding the question of why did Jeffrey Epstein have so many scientists around him, top level scientists all the time. And it was essentially, I think Andrew Huberman also spoke of this, but it was essentially that the scientists wanted funding. The funding of a couple millions that they required was nothing for Jeffrey Epstein. And Jeffrey Epstein wanted to have a good public image. So it was a mutual beneficial relationship. And yes, as a scientist, I do think that you need to have your morals on point. But again, the morality is a different topic.
But let's dive a bit deeper into that, because I think it's a very important observation that society, or we have to become kind of conscious of a society, right? Because
define conscious.
We rationally know why we do certain things, or why we give, for example, certain rights to people, right? It's just not that's because we do it that way.
Yep.
So take, for example, like the judge class, if you want to call it that, right? There are people that are forever financially stable to the rest of their lives. There is like a societal institution that allows you to, like, which kind of allows you to make actual ethical choices. But these people...
Do you think objective morality exists then?
It really depends on what you interpret as objective. So, we have to open an entirely different box there. But like objective, that there is like a universal ethics and morality, yes, there is. You can like...
Where do you attribute that?
there are, so if I want to define it mathematically, there are optimal, like, prisoner dilemma solutions to certain situations, right? That's ethics in the most general sense. It's like, how can I make the most general, like, how can I act in a way that the most optimal solution arises in these game theoretic
Correct, but
concepts?
you do need a moral compass to guide you within that context.
Sure thing. I mean, if you're starving, the law of the jungle applies, right? You're just gonna kill to save your ego, right? The ego steps in and actually tries to protect you from certain death. And so that's again with the material way, in regards to objective reality, we humans don't really make ethical, like universally ethical choices if our own livelihood is at stake. Right? A judge cannot make an ethical choice if his life is threatened, for example. A judge cannot make an ethical choice if his children are involved, because that's kind of part of his existence, part of his life that he has to decide over, which is like kind of killing in a weird way, part of himself. And so, yeah, he can't make an ethical choice there. And
For a person who supports the notion of objective morality but completely rejects the concept of free will is also something I found fascinating because they are related.
How so?
Free will with objective morality.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you assume the notion of objective morality, you also have to assume that you would use that morality to make a choice.
But where does this choice arise?
In what way?
So let's make a very little experiment, and I mean the viewers can also do that at home. Just try to observe, like, get into like a small meditative state and actually try to observe your next thought. Just take a deep breath in and just try to observe the next thought that actually pops in your brain. Let's be quiet for a second and actually do that.
Okay.
Where does this manifest from? Do you have control over that?
I do not have control, knowing from recent neuroscience. We also know that whenever a thought appears on our mind, the electrical impulse has been received by the neurons before. So if I decide to pick up that glass, essentially the electrical transmission has happened before I even make the conscious decision of picking up the glass. However, why would this necessarily reject the notion of free will? If you reject the notion of free will, first you have to explore what that would cause. It would cause all heroes deprived of that role and all criminals also deprived of that role because it eliminates personal responsibility. So the entire, because if you steal something, you didn't make the choice to steal something because you don't have free will. So if you don't have free will, you also shouldn't have the responsibility on your shoulders of that specific action.
I mean, it doesn't give me right to punish you. I can still ask for you to exchange the damages that it's caused. And that's the difference, right? Like, to tie it into a certain different field in sociology, right? We know that capital punishment per se, especially imprisonment, does not really do anything positive for society. It costs a fortune. And unless you do like the more slave labor kind of approach to imprisonment, it does not benefit society in any way. And I mean, we probably, like most people would probably agree that slave labor inherently is not morally right and just. So people that get completely withdrawn from society because of imprisonment, like they lose all their social connections, right? Just think about it. You're in prison for 4 years, you're completely separate from society, you're completely excluded from all social activities. You will just lose all your friends, right? And that's like the true punishment of imprisonment is like
isolation.
Isolation,
in all ways.
In many ways, yeah. I mean, your loved ones will probably see you, but that's gonna happen like a couple of weeks, not much more.
How does that tie to the topic of free will?
I mean, because we can look at the data and here again use the scientific method to like try and figure out actually that has positive impact on people, right? So let's say we want to reintroduce these people again, and well, they've been murderers and whatever in the past, or like thieves and stole like fortunes, and we see that these people never, many of them never get back up again. And for example, if you make the comparisons to very lenient legal systems where people actually get educated during prison time and actually getting fed and get up back on their feet so they can actually earn money within the prison system to then actually have a living when they get back out.
The legal system, though, doesn't necessarily reflect what is right and what is wrong. For a long time in Nazi Germany, there were plenty of things that were considered normal that today we at least think of as criminal. However,
I would even say it's worse than that because we call it like it's ethically so abhorrent we don't even want to talk about it publicly.
exactly.
And there's so much shame attached to it that like even if someone is trying to learn and understand, right, he even gets publicly shamed for making up these questions, even though that can be from a very certain amount of interest. Because well, you have to play somehow, right? Like you have to experiment with these ideas to actually find a way how something is morally abhorrent.
For sure, you have to collect data before understanding.
I want to get into a bit more detail there, right? Because, well, there is a kind of a jingo and ethnocentrist in all of us, right? Like this is something that we, at a certain time of development, lose usually, because we can see that, well, ethnical borders are so minute in many instances that it's not an accurate divider between people, right? Personality is a much bigger divider than ethnics, right? Even though there might be genetic biases in certain cultures and certain races. I don't even want to use that word. I'm sorry. And especially when you're younger or like not as developed, you might see this as a genuine pattern and ask, like, I can see something here. Why can't we talk about it? And if you publicly shame these people into isolation or like into certain echo chambers, you don't really actually give them a ladder to aspire out of that, right? Because the function collapses in itself. It's so it's much less accurate as a descriptor of the world than like the more high functioning system we have created, right? Like personality scales and in psychology and so forth. Which if we isolate those people, we're just going to lose them. And I don't really like this about like our current, I don't want to call it discourse level, but acceptance of people that have been, and it goes back to the question of free will, that might have been misguided or just had extremely disfortunate circumstances.
Well, that I find extremely interesting, which is also my problem with what you hear from philosophical sources about free will. There is either free will or there isn't, which I find deeply flawed in the way that I do not understand why there has to be or there has not to be free will. I think there is free will to a specific extent. Like if we think of a game of chess, you have specific rules you need to adhere to. And I am making a metaphor here because life could also be considered a game in more than one ways. But in chess, you have a lot of rules that you need to adhere to, and you might think of the rules as limits. But usually, what is a limit also limits your freedom. However, if you actually adhere to those rules and you play the game with those rules, in chess specifically, it gives you almost infinite possibilities of games of chess. So I find very fascinating how something that can limit you, meaning for sure we do not have maximum free will in everything, but something that could limit you could also unlock another potential of free will within that context.
Maybe this resonates with you. You're probably familiar with the concept of a noble lie. And could I summarize your point with being able to tell a noble lie to yourself that actually allows you to break certain patterns and misplaced behavior. Is that a fair
Well,
assessment?
that would be a form of a cognitive bias,
Mhm.
essentially.
Sure thing. I mean, means certain successful cultures really are clingy to that concept. And I think probably that contributed to that effect. But like,
Meaning convincing yourself that you have free will when
yes,
you actually do not.
yes. I think the Western cultures, and especially Christianity, really hammers that point home. And it
How
kind
come?
I mean, it's the big noble lie that Christians tell themselves. I'm entirely free from society, and that's largely where our individualist culture comes from, and it gives you a lot of power, right? And adaptive capacity. I shouldn't really say power because it's a very emotional word. Mm, I mean, if you have this adaptive capacity in individuals, that usually means that the individual strives for betterment of oneself, and that's probably universally a good thing. While if you learn the fact of free will too early, you might misunderstand it. Well, my situation is fucked. I can't really do anything. The outside is like guilty of that, and therefore, yeah, I would just live a life in complete ignorance. That's not how it should be. So, well, there's always this kind of trade-off you have to do in society, right? Like between general rules that you generally apply to society, and like the specific truths that maybe some people are more able to actually like comprehend with. Mm,
Okay.
for example, you probably shouldn't tell your child that's like 6 years old about the crimes the Nazis did in like the full extent, right? Because it's so morally abhorrent and so brutal and disgusting that this could emotionally break him. Like, what does this trauma do? You wouldn't, for example, send your like 6-year-old child into a war zone if you had the choice, because you know this is gonna damage that child and it will probably not lead to any kind of positive development that we would all want to have. And I mean, you can also tie it back into science, right? Like to neurology. If you live through trauma that early, it's very likely that you become like a very damaged person till the end of your life, that your stress responses, your anxiety is completely disordered, and you will have some permanent PTSD.
So your argument to the core, if I am understanding it correctly, is that
Mhm,
since you are a product of nature and nurture,
mhm,
these are the reason you do not have free will. They shape you in a way that you do not make your own decisions.
mhm. Well, these are things like, I give you an example of science, and you talked about beforehand about quantum. These are things that, from a certain perspective, are both true statements. Yes, you have free will in a sense that you can choose to tell yourself the noble lie, which allows you all these good things in life. Well, yes, it's also true that, well, free will doesn't really exist. Like both of these statements can be true at the same time. Much like saying, well, here's light coming, and this light is a photon. Yes, but it can also be a wave and behave in wave like mechanics, right? And so both of these statements are also true. They describe the same phenomena. We want to be conscious agents. We want to think about how to make choices in this world.
Go back to Christianity and self-convincing of free will.
Mm-hmm. So in Christianity, there exists this idea of the divine in all of us. So the God, the individual God that each human possesses.
Yes.
And I mean, other cultures have that as well, to a certain extent. Buddhism, it's more like the inner salvation that any human has the opportunity to achieve. Hmm. I'm I'm not too sure how to actually place that because I'm not there yet. Mm, there's this concept that the older you get and the more developed you are as a human being, you kind of get access to kind of being in contact with that divinity. And I mean, this manifests in different ways in the different religious traditions.
Sure.
You can hear Martin Luther talk about being in contact with God and actually having a conversation with him. You can read the same thing about about the Buddha being kind of in a touch with the divine. And So yeah, mm, it most certainly exists. And if you would want to call that like free will of being in conversation with the divine, with God, if you want to call it that, yeah, sure, do it. I mean, if it ultimately leads to a more positive world, up to a certain extent, of course, sure. Why not? Why cause trauma in people?
The
Then
way I see it is that you have the most free will you will get the further you are from something occurring.
mhm,
And as this comes closer and closer, the less free will you have. And I will explain what I mean.
okay.
In a practical sense, to somebody that could use that for his life, let's say that you have a goal, you have an aim,
Mhm,
you want to try with discipline towards something specific.
mhm,
If that which you are going to accomplish happens in 10 years,
mhm,
the decisions you make today will bring that closer or further.
mhm,
So you begin from a point where you have the most free will in the way that you can choose to work today
mhm.
and not be a hedonistic, lazy person who just eats Cheetos all day.
Okay.
The closer you come to this event,
Mhm,
the less free will you have. Because if 9 years have passed
mhm,
from your 10-year-old goal and now you have a single year,
mhm,
there is a specific amount of things that you can change
mhm.
with your will because most of it is done.
Okay.
I find this fascinating again in the sense that I do not find free will an absolute concept.
Mhm,
I find that there are things you do have control over and things you don't have control over. For example, the who dies and who stays and who you are going to have in your life is not something that you can really choose,
mhm,
but it is affecting you. So we could make the argument that it is not part of your free will. However, other things, in terms of how you're going to be in your life spiritually,
mhm,
I think you do have some control over. I do not necessarily adhere to the notion that you are convincing yourself of it.
mhm. I mean, what you believe in ultimately leads to choices, right? And
For sure.
these choices will manifest in a way.
How does consciousness fit here then?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting part, right? The gaping hole in all of philosophy. Ooh. Well, I'm not able to answer that, unfortunately. Like I would be touring every university in this world if I could. And so, I mean, it's very likely that the outside probably interacts with us and with the divine to a certain extent, right? Like we are,
Do
like,
you believe in the divine?
yeah, there is most certainly like a golden string that um, I have sensed to a certain extent that is like a path and maybe even a calling. I have talked to a couple of people that truly describe this like as a white light of pure bliss and meaning. I'm not there yet. Maybe I'm too young. Maybe I'm not. I've not used enough LSD. I'm not really using it. I've never used it actually. Um, however, yeah. So that's something I'm looking forward to. Maybe at some point in my life experiencing. It seems to really show you necessary paths. Like it's pure meaning in the most rawest sense of the word, right? Like you will get like a supreme calling to make certain actions. It completely overrides all your predispositions and any kind of ego that might hurt you. Mm. Because it's truth,
That
right?
would be the ultimate state.
Yeah. I mean, much like the Buddha, right? Like complete enlightenment of actually being, I mean, the way it's most often described is like perspective-less perspective, right? I've completely separated myself from my own existence, and I've become
Well, there are
only aware.
many differences in different religions. For
Mhm,
example, in And that's a key difference, if not the most important one, with Christianity. In
Mhm.
Christianity, you aim to live a life as similar to Christ's as possible. You are looking to level up yourself
Mhm.
with discipline to a certain
Mhm.
extent, to specific life values you need to adhere to. In Buddhism, the opposite happens. You do not aim to reach God or Christ, and that's not being Him, but aiming to reach Him. But you're trying to, in a way, take the spiritual part of yourself from yourself
Mhm.
away.
Mhm.
And that also occurs with the fasting process
Mhm.
and with a lot of efforts to minimize your human existence as much as possible.
Mm, I don't think it's minimization because it's much more like a sensory deprivation. But I mean, that's what meditation is, that's what fasting is. So you kind of reduce the influences of the craving of the ego manifesting itself and saying, I want this, that has to happen, that should be. And by letting go of that, you become more of a complete agent, right? Because well, that's what you might consider as free will, right? Like not adhering to these impulses, right? Not being as impulsive. Not, I don't want to eat these sweets now. I don't want to like, I don't know, eat all these fats in the McDonald's or whatever. And so, yeah, if you want to call it that, sure.
I would say that in Buddhism, what I found was to what you're describing, which I would say also applies to Christianity. To Buddhism, I also found an element of punishment, which I also found in Protestant Christianity.
Okay.
The element of guilt,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, Nietzsche would certainly disagree with any discussion of taking power away from you, which is also the reason he criticized Christianity so
Mm-hmm.
hard all the time. But
Mm-hmm.
I think he was referring mostly to Protestant Christianity.
Yeah, well, hmm. You have a point then, most certainly. And trying to summarize it in a way, there is most certainly something within the concept of guilt and like supreme guilt, as much as the Protestants use it. There's certainly a kind of just like pressuring the individual to a fullest extent. And that's totalitarianism in a different way, right? If you have no balance between the group, the commons, and the individual, right, you get like the kind of hyper, like capitalistic, every man for himself, super on steroids competition like the US has right now, right? Like that's the manifestation of that idea that everybody is just guilty for his own actions, but there is no collective guilt of a certain way.
Yep.
And so, I mean, we can kind of observe that now. That's the like logical, I won't call it final, but the fullest extent of that idea, because that idea has become totalitarian itself. It's become so powerful, so potent. The Americans can't really let go of that. So they are not willing to accept any kind of group dynamic that led to the issues that they are now seeing internally.
This
Oh,
also introduces an element of polarization, for sure.
yeah.
But what do you think about the current political climate?
Well, where to even start? Um, I mean, the issue about politics is that it's usually a relative game.
In what way?
Well, I have my certain perspective and what I consider to be ought and right and truthful and meaningful. And now I want to make an adaptation. But that's not perspectiveless, right? So we want to, like, especially if we want to talk politics, we should ground it in some form of, I don't want to call it absolute truth or objective truth because that's very material. But yeah, on a universalist, like graded on a universalist value, I don't want to call it hierarchy, but table. There are certain, the reason why I'm trying to be very careful with these words is because, well, words, especially if they're connected with trauma, they can completely shut off your rational side of your brain. Like you won't even think about certain like topics other than having like an emotional reactionary response to it to kind of protect your own emotional well-being.
I think this is a great reference to the postmodernist idea of reality as an expression of a narrative story.
Mm-hmm.
We do not have the capability to not think in a language, which is also things like journaling can also
Mm-hmm.
unlock so much about
Mm-hmm.
yourself that you
Yeah.
might have not even considered.
Mm-hmm.
Because language is the way we manifest emotions and
Mm-hmm.
thoughts. Whatever consciousness, if I may use the
Mm-hmm.
word, exists, I think our only chance of letting that out is the written word.
Mm-hmm. And the spoken word as well, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a couple of terms that like people react extremely emotional about. And again, invite the viewer to really think about that deeply. I can name a couple out of the top of my head. I mean, I already named a couple. Nazis, communism, capitalism, social justice.
I mean, you cannot eliminate sensitivity about specific topics because
Yeah.
humans are highly emotional beings.
Yes. I mean, but shouldn't the aspiration of each and everyone be to be capable of talking about these things like they would to their own child? Like, wouldn't you want to explain to him how
I
these...
am certainly for open discourse,
Mhm.
100%.
Mhm.
It's a very blurred line
Mhm.
nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, because we're all a bit irritated because we can't really make sense of this world. There's not, and you talked about the story, there's not really a story that most people subscribe to anymore. And that's probably the reason why, especially, I mean, our generation like deep dives into the hedonistic
Yeah.
abyss of like extreme levels of sexual stimulation. And so, yeah, you've got all the kind of soft porno stuff on Instagram and whatever, right? It's just like, this is like the outer edge of the normal distribution of what we are witnessing.
It's a misplacement of needs,
Mm-hmm. To a
I
certain
would
extent,
say.
yes.
It's a misplacement. That has not been something new.
Mm.
If we just take a look at the Roman Empire, the enemies were inside Rome and they hadn't even noticed because
Mm.
they were in the circus and the other half were engaging in orgies,
Yeah,
which I think was a huge component of the fall of the Roman Empire.
yes.
But
That and the slave labor.
yes, what do you have to say, to comment on the hedonistic side of humanity and the trajectory it is on?
Yeah, I mean, hedonism ultimately is an absence of meaning, right? There is not a story that people actually subscribe to that they find meaningful, right? Like, especially if you're stuck in a very materialistic sense that, like, I want to be able to provide, be a provider, and especially many young men in a world where we have complete material abundance, that's not a calling. And then, in a way, the postmodern approach, which is like, yeah, let's make everybody included. I mean, this also has like a collapse function, and that's like, well, we've got psychopaths that abuse these things, right? And people would turn it up to the max, and that means you will ultimately have to discriminate against them. This is the famous point Popper made, right? Like you have to discriminate against the discriminatory, which is a paradox in itself, and that probably means that it's very true. So yeah, that manifests, and well, I'm now in the process of even trying to like formulate with a couple of rogue people on the internet, of trying to somewhat define a new story that might give meaning to people.
What have you found so far?
Mm, it's most certainly not easy. That's, I think, because otherwise it would have happened already, right? Kind of in a meaning crisis, and especially when I talk to a lot of people who have found a bit of meaning and left their own hedonistic side behind them, a lot of suffering was required to do that, because it's a very fundamental shift in conscious understanding of suffering.
You criticized Christianity before, but you're,
Did I?
in a way,
Okay.
but you are essentially describing the central aim of
Mhm.
Christianity, which is meaning through, if not suffering, responsibility. To truly, and I am also very annoyed
Mhm.
each time I hear somebody say that he's a Christian,
Mhm.
using the term way too loosely.
Mhm.
To truly be a Christian in the correct way means to actually aim to carry the burden of the cross on your own shoulders,
Mhm.
which also unlocks a specific level of fulfillment which
Mhm.
came from responsibility and partly suffering.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you said that really well. Extremely good summarization. Most people like see in the teachings of Christianity a form of like negative quality reduction.
Nietzsche did too.
Yes. However, I mean, Buddhism especially teaches us that existence per se is suffering.
Mm.
Camus makes some very important points in that regard, right? You can only really choose how to deal with suffering and how you interpret it, right? That's your power, that's your agency, that's your free will, right? Um, However, in a world where you can just completely distract yourself with a lot of material pleasure and drugs that are just at your fingertips, you can always access LSD, you can always just get a bit of heroin or fentanyl or whatever, right? Just with the snap of your fingers, especially with your material opportunities in Europe and North America. So this becomes very attractive. And so, yeah, many people get trapped in these systems. They get
I, I,
addicted.
I don't have a problem understanding why
Mhm.
it is so attractive to watch 3 hours of Netflix, maybe log into a couple different of
Mhm.
another kind websites for a couple hours and then finish with a couple of burgers,
Mhm.
maybe. But it is the epitome of immaturity in the
Mhm.
sense
Okay.
that I would define maturity as following the discipline of today and perhaps
Mhm.
even the pain
Mhm.
for the reward which is going to come.
I mean, that's a story you tell yourself, right?
For sure.
Which is also a certain acceptance of pain. Yeah, but ultimately it's about finding a story that is more universal in that sense, right? Something that can actually truly grapple you. And I find it interesting that you just talked about like Netflix and watching movies. I have observed myself through my process now over the last 4 years or something of like integrating all these things and meditating a lot and just thinking about thinking really, that I can't even open a series for more than one episode. I get bored afterwards. Like I can watch for 45 minutes and then my brain's just like, Jesus, that's how could I even enjoy it in the beginning?
They have done an experiment where they put rats in isolation and they put a bucket of water and a bucket of heroin.
Yeah.
And all the rats just swam into the heroin. And then they introduced other rats in the caves as well. And they had different wheels where they could play and
Mhm.
other rats with which they could socialize.
Mhm.
And they stopped drinking the heroin and started drinking water just by introducing this element of something of higher meaning,
Mhm.
which I find unbelievably interesting.
Mhm. Yeah, talk to these like super addicted drug addicts, right? They have no perspective in life. They're just like lost. Like they are lost souls that they are craving to cling on to anything meaningful. Mm.
You have a hard choice to make when you go through something hard.
Mhm.
And I think that applies to everybody
Mhm.
because you can face it,
Mhm.
which in the mythical nature could be to
Mhm.
slay the dragon,
Mhm.
or you can sit and look at him,
Mhm.
but your fear has to manifest somehow.
Mhm.
And if you do not slay the dragon, that fear persists, and you do have to find something to cover it up.
Mhm. Yeah, and I really like your analogy and also bringing in that antique mythic.
And the dragon also shows that there's also a treasure behind it,
Mhm. Yes.
which everybody forgets nowadays, because especially with social media, we tend to focus only on the scary.
Mhm.
We do not see that something meaningful could come out of it.
Yeah. But I mean, the dragon, in your analogy, is not as public and not as graspable because it's like a devious little gnome, like a super stealthy kind of addiction, right? Like the evil god of society right now is addiction. Um, and just most people don't want to slay it. Like it can be addiction to porn, it can be addiction to social media, it can be addiction to some drug, and actually pushing through that. And I think, like for example, C.G. Jung, made a really interesting point to that. It's like to actually lose something, you have to fully embrace it.
Mm.
To actually pass addiction, you will fully have to embrace that addiction. And if you, and that's very also ties into your rat experiment, right? Like they had to completely overuse it, the heroin, to like get the collective decision to a point where they're like, fuck this, like we don't want to do this anymore. And something very similar is happening to us as a society in a weird way, right? Like we introduced all these systems that monetize and capitalize of like collective choice making, sense making, whatsoever, right? Like the attention economy, so to speak. And now we're starting to see like that certain people have just lost complete meaning in that, and they can feel that it's like entrenching them. And so you start to see like first laws enacted, right? Which is like a like society-wide impulse to like an autoimmune reaction to reduce certain aspects of these, right? Like GDPR is a good example, where we basically said, well, yeah, let's not do all the kind of data sharing with everybody because, well, probably not that ethical. And you should have a bit more control of that because before you didn't even have a choice, right? Like you couldn't even choose to manage your data, like delete it
I don't
from
know
the
the
internet.
extent to which you can choose the ways with which you manage your data now either.
Sure, but I mean, it's much easier to get somewhat of a choice.
Mm.
Yeah, and so usually people are quite simple, and especially when it comes to risk calculation, and even having like the threat in the air of like potentially you will lose all your fortune because you made a choice like 10 years ago to break some sort of law. Most people will not choose to actually enact on like do these things just because, well, we want to reduce risk. We are like super risk aware, and so yeah, I'm not too sure that there's too much fraud happening. Fraud usually comes out because it's really hard to keep up a lie.
Is that something you are interested in on a professional level
Yes,
with your business?
not only in my business but especially in politics. Like the older I get, the more I get the feeling of like, well, most of the time it's just incompetence because of like lack of awareness of different things, right? We are all just trying to do our best, and sometimes this causes suffering, right? But it's just because we don't see it, right? It's not being shown to us. And I think that's the point Aaron made with our observation at Nuremberg of the benevolent evil, it's not like that we are constantly challenging us to see more, because a very small amount of people actually have that gift. The true innovators, the priests of each generation, that actually want to push intellectually forward, that actually constantly have that craving. I want to be able to see more, right? The Buddhas of each generation. So that most people, they're just living in their modus operandi and they're not seeing further, right? And so
How does that tie to the concept of immortality, which is being explored more and more in the recent years?
I mean, what truly gets immortal for you as a person is like the archetype you expressed, right? You can evolve it, and that kind of ties into the total history of humanity. That's the infinite life the Christians talk about. You become one with the Gemeinschaft, with the group of saints. You become a saint because your story got interwoven into humanity's story, into all conscious beings. Because, well, you probably know the butterfly effect, right?
Yep.
Any conscious move can create wonder, ultimately. Your tiny remark to a little boy, giving him hope and reducing his trauma or suffering, right, could have been the next Einstein. And so, I mean, that's the universalist value there, that the only thing you can do is be ethical, be moral, because you don't know. That's the uncertainty of existence, right? I don't know what my actions actually cause, so I better choose the most and best and most moral path forward, because
Don't you think this is also, though, powered by this sense of urgency that you are going to die? I
just
remember I discussed this in my previous podcast with Arijit, who
mhm,
is a brilliant, brilliant guy. And he said that it reminds him of this poem by Tithonus,
mhm,
where the he asked about immortality, but he forgot to say that he wants to stay young. So he kept aging more
mhm,
and more, where
yeah,
eventually he had to be converted into a grasshopper,
mhm,
which goes back to the old Latin wisdom of memento mori, that you are going to die.
mhm.
And it shouldn't stir you, but it should at least wake you up.
Mhm.
What does it mean to be immortal if it is not well placed?
I mean, we have to get back to the idea of the noble lie there, right? Like the promise of immortality can help your ego to step back a bit. And if that's a hack to hack your subconscious into being more conscious uh, and acting less impulsively, then that's probably a good thing. Mm. So, yeah, a lot of wisdom in this world that's being taught to us as children, like we only realize at a later stage what it actually meant, right? So in each statement, there could be 100 different meanings for each like position you are in your life, right? Because you're not aware, like you don't see it. You don't, especially when you're young, you can't hold all this complexity. And so, and that's what I talked before, and with the perspectiveless perspective, a good teacher is able to adapt to the person he's sitting opposing of, because it should be my duty to actively guide you to something you can actually hold on to.
I find that also interesting with a lot of professors in universities.
Mhm,
I used to study sciences before I started studying medicine,
mhm,
and there are a lot of professors who have absolutely no problem saying that most of you are actually going to fail because the
mhm,
test is going to be so hard
mhm.
and you will have to retake the class. Like, congratulations, you're a shitty professor.
Yeah.
This is not the point. The point is to treat each individual as with his own intelligence.
I mean, it seems quite obvious that you can't really change intelligence, right? It seems very genetically dependent, but that doesn't mean that you can judge people on it, right? Like, you have to be kind of benevolent about it. The idea should be that you, with all your empathy, can accept everybody's part of society. Now, I don't use these words because these are one of, like, IQ, for example, is also one of these words that truly resonates deeply emotionally with most people. But I think it's an interesting concept, even though the metric, as the most psychologists use it, is a bit flawed.
In what way?
It's used, like, the intention why it was created is different than how it's actually applied nowadays. The intention of IQ in the beginning was to create an incompetence metric. So to try and mathematically prove how mentally incompetent you are, to say differently. That has value, right? Like, especially with the military application, right? If you are at war, you want to quickly find people that are just not helpful, that are just annoying from an organizational standpoint, or just hinder you, basically. I think it's a more neutral term. Then you want to quickly discard people, right? Like in drafts, for example. But nowadays it's being used in a way that tries to prove exceptional intellectual ability.
AI certainly disrupted that.
Yeah. And also, well, I mean, Nassim Taleb talks about this a lot, right? About the sandal-wearing Mensa guy that has no clue in this world and is not
Yes.
conscious whatsoever. And that's also true. But I mean, there we're talking about like the agency that you possess, and that, like, telling yourself that you're so intellectual and therefore you're such a capable person is also no lie to just be completely incompetent. So yeah, there it also has this adverse effect. So
I am deeply fascinated by IQ
Mhm.
and a lot of the parameters around it. You see very, very super interesting statistics in psychology when the topic is IQ. Women with higher IQ tend to marry much less,
Yeah.
which I also find super, super interesting.
Mhm.
And then you also have the concept that if your IQ exceeds a specific grade, you introduce other forms of mental suffering regarding your view around existence,
Mhm.
mortality, morality, consciousness. And I have met actually people who belong in that category, and it is fascinating to say the least,
Mhm.
but also it should serve as a reality check to everybody who wishes their IQ was 240. It comes with other problems.
Yeah. I mean, IQ certainly has especially an expectation factor that should not be underestimated. So I, as a young child, also did IQ tests, and this most certainly fucked with my super ego. Because especially if parents don't receive that well, they create expectations in their children, which are extremely damaging.
Would you say that's an experience you had?
Yes, most certainly. So my mother was extremely self-obsessed in a weird way, especially when she was younger. Nowadays she became much more aware, which is amazing to see, to witness, like growth in human beings. But we can talk about like the menopause as like an interesting effect in women, especially in regards to the grandmother paradox, if you've heard of that. So yeah, so my mother, when I was younger, basically showed me around and basically said, yeah, my son is going to be a professor at some time and someday, which is not really the most ideal thing to do to young children, to have like the expectation, oh, I have to completely dominate everybody around me, right? That's like, yeah, you can't handle with that pressure. It just makes you implode at some point, like how I imploded at a certain stage in my life. And it can be extremely traumatic, or you can certainly extend it to a certain extent and actually learn from that. because I mean that's suffering. I mean there's this term
Carl Jung said something regarding that. I do not remember the exact phrasing, but
Leidensdruck is the term.
one of the greatest wrongs that can happen to a child is the unlived lives of the parents being forced upon them.
Yeah, well, that's very true, especially in my case as well. Yeah, my mother was always extremely like she still feels a bit of resentment towards her parents that they never allowed her to study, and she's having that expectation in her brain that she could have been a doctor or some form of academic in her life.
How would you say that shaped you and your academic progress, and
Mm,
also regarding your current entrepreneurial activities?
yeah, I mean, my parents still want me not to be the kind of gung ho person I am, especially right now. They are much more interested in stability than me. They have a lower level of accepted uncertainty. But I mean, that's fine. That's like perspective and emotional like values that you have. So I'm not judging them on that end. Um, Especially my mother would still love to see me becoming a professor at some point for the prestige, of course. But yeah, that's like I mean, parents want the best for the children, and they are loving, and I love them. So that's ultimately what's important. So yeah, but what I found the most fascinating is that after the time my mother went through menopause, she became a much more enlightened individual. Like she ascended a lot of her trauma. She became a lot more irrational and a lot more capable human being. It's absolutely crazy that that happened. I found that really, really fascinating. And so, because, and I think this is probably the most important idea of the grandmother paradox is that women have, and I'm using a mathematical term here, a forcing function, so pressure point that's put on them in the menopause where they lose kind of their femininity in a weird way. They become like sexually neutral somewhat. So they have like much less sexual drive. They have much less like competition mechanics because they can't really get children anymore. And so they have to completely redefine and reinvent themselves, right? Which gives a lot of potential to actually reinvent yourself and let go for past traumas and all that stuff, right? And especially we young guys can learn a lot from that, I feel. Especially having like actively trying to choose much more interaction with like older women, like 60 plus, especially really wise ones. I think this has shown me a lot. I'm really thankful for being given the opportunity to have these kinds of conversation. And yeah, I think that's something because we talked beforehand about the hedonistic thing and the meaning crisis, if you want to call it that, that because we have become so much older as a society that we are not growing up with our grandparents, right? So the kind of natural effect that you grew up with your grandparents who then instilled in you all the wisdom of the previous generations into them, that's just gone, right? We just grew up with our parents. We're completely separated. We put our elder in like daycare centers and not interacting with them at all. While in previous times, the elders were actually the ones occupied with childcare. And so if we want to talk about like a value that has gone missing, especially in the modern world, it's probably that one. Like the most like one of the strongest educational rifts we have created. And so yeah, that is something we have to find a modern, don't really want to call it modern solution to like to substitute that to a certain way. And I claim that the internet certainly has way for that because well you see 60 plus people now openly talking about wisdom online, right? And the young are flocking to it like crazy, especially young men, because we don't have meaning, right?
I think this is also the reason why Jordan Peterson has become so famous.
Yeah, he's like the grandfather of a more conservative type of person, and because they all don't have grandfathers that interacted with them, right? And we have a kind of again divine
Nature.
nature idea that that's something we want to learn from. And so there's a like natural craving for it. And certainly my development as well started with Peterson. I left him behind because I think I've surpassed many of his teachings. And well, as a teacher, again, you have to you play a role, you play a certain part, right? And Peterson has kind of chosen a stage of people that he wants to help, that I'd claim I have surpassed and actually properly integrated into myself, which is like the kind of super boyish, kind of immature, just being like grown up with completely traditional law and order kind of ideas, to actually put them up into a like complete modernist perspective, like how to be productive, be like a kind of social person, how to earn a living, and so on and so forth, which is
I find highly interesting the transition Jordan Peterson has made towards the role of theology more and more in the recent years. And I find it deeply interesting because, first of all, he's a very high IQ individual. I think that's fair to say for anybody, even if they dislike him. He was a professor of psychology, which means he was interested to understand how the human mind operates and what is human nature at its core. And I think after a specific point, he saw something more, which he hadn't before, which was that sciences can only be saturated to a specific degree. And after a certain point, you have to introduce something of a higher state of being. And I think this is why he started investigating theology way harder for that purpose, which is something I find fascinating. And I see many people do in their life. And from the old times, you saw many scientists being very fascinated in the philosophical and theological meanings. Even many people don't know this actually, but even Schrödinger wrote a book regarding life and meaning.
Heisenberg as well, right?
Yep.
Especially the early like champions of the quantum revolution, if you want to call it that, all had massive interest in philosophy and the philosophy behind the quantum, right?
Yes, because for many years we thought that we know how nature operates. Yes. And then quantum theory drops and everybody starts rethinking their entire perspective around what is the world.
Yeah.
And so much which we still have absolutely no idea about.
I mean, this creates a kind of meaning crisis for them, right? Like they're the first ones that had to deal with the idea of like, stuff is not concrete, right? It depends on perspective. That's like the great idea that physics introduced, like in the beginning. It depends on how I look at it, what it actually manifests. That's the great, like on a social level, we would call this postmodernism, right? My perspective depends how I feel about something. I can be extremely emotionally damaging to a person, even though it does not feel emotionally damaging to me, right? Of course, this can create access and like brutality to it, because if you are addicted or like you're encapsulated by the totalitarian aspects of that, you cause suffering through your actions again, right? Like it's not gauged, it's not in balance, right? It's not in the golden mean of interaction. However, the postmodern idea per se is really important. It's especially really important for the quantum understanding. And so, yeah, especially when we talked politics beforehand, the complete negation of many of the postmodern values that are important and to understand and not have a traumatic interaction with it, to have a more clear picture of the world. Yeah.
It also annoys me a lot in the scientific field when somebody does not allow any space for anything else than that he believes. your entire viewpoint essentially depends on the data you have received and the processing you have made of those data. I understand that it follows very strictly the cognitive model, but you cannot really argue that it doesn't occur, at least to a very high degree. If you have not received more data, it is impossible that you will know something additional. You have to allow space for new data to come, whether that's in the science or in your life.
That's the famous saying by Socrates, right? I know that I know nothing.
Yeah.
Which is just paraphrased, but I think you just said, right? Like, always be prepared that whatever you think is true is wrong, right? That's the idea of Nassim Taleb of the black swan, right? You can see all the white swans in the world and just say, well, obviously swans are white, right? Then you go to Australia and you're like, oh, Jesus. Brain explodes. Yeah. If there's one thing that reality always teaches us, it's like, don't be biased. Fuck you. You will always get fucked over if you are. So, yeah. That's, if there's one truth, one universal truth.
How do you view bias in the current political state?
Bias in the political sphere. I mean, it really depends on what you call bias and just people not being able to actually see what they're causing. Or you can call it incompetence, right?
I mean, I find it super funny that the political left was very, very highly promoting electric vehicles for the purpose of saving the environment. And to the point where they could even look at you with an element of disrespect if you didn't drive a Tesla. And now they are vandalizing the very cars they frowned upon if you didn't have.
How fast political alliances can change, right? I mean, to unpack that and give like a positive and well-meaning and understanding answer takes a bit of time because it's very complex. Like the current political situation is extremely complex because, again, it's like most people can't make sense of it. That's why they feel so helpless and just confused, quite frank. We are right now entering like a stage of existence because our models of the world are incomplete, ultimately. And certain, especially like systems and institutions that we've built, kind of are losing their mandate to a certain way, right? Like the mandates are usually created because they serve a certain ought, right? Like we ought to do something and we're doing it because we feel that's morally right and just. But to manifest action in the world, you actually have to have the optionality, right? That's the thing that Nietzsche talks about so much, power. You can call optionality power, right? Like I can actually make choices. That's what he talks in Herrenmoral. That, well, you have to even be able to make a choice to even be moral of some sort. And now we have to introduce a system of thought that we would call externalities. Because there is a way to create power by moving or like kind of deviously moving externalities in a certain direction, right? Like if I can kind of deceive you for taking care of my waste, for example, so I run a power plant, for example, and I can deceive you where I put my waste, well, then I just get like all the advantages and all of the disadvantages, right? That's amazing. Cool. Right? Like to say it very bluntly, like brutally, if I can kill a person and make somebody else guilty for it, I get all the advantage and you get all the disadvantage. And we can see these externalities in many systems right now failing because the systems are stretched to the limits. This is true of energy, for example, right? Like we still produce like 2/3 of global energy with carbohydrates, so coal, oil, gas, which produce externalities that we all kind of have to deal with, right? Like heating of the planet and so on and so forth. That's an issue because, well, privatize the gains, socialize the losses. That's not really a fair deal, right? If I'm an energy company and I can collectivize the losses in a weird way, so say, well, society has to deal with it, but I want to make my profit, then just I profit from it and you have all the bill, like you all get the bill. That's an issue.
I do not think that in life you can do anything without at some point snapping back right to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I it is also the reason I find Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky so unbelievably maybe the best masterpiece ever written,
Mm-hmm.
because he gets away with the murder he has committed.
Mm-hmm.
He finally gets away and he gets the police off his back,
Mm-hmm.
and he goes and turns himself in, which shows that even if you escape the matrix, there is still the reality within you, and you cannot eliminate that.
Yeah, I resonate with what you just said. I mean, ultimately, it's always about like reintegrating all the externalities we've caused, like in each generation, right? So, kind of Faustian period, right, where we became from like hunter-gatherers into like actually building stuff with, like building the pyramids and creating like agricultural societies. The main externality was slavery, and it took a bit to like reintegrate that, right? Like we can't have god kings. That's not really moral. We can more fairly attribute the gains, right? Like, yes, the pyramids are beautiful, but is it truly nice to limit all that potential that's like lives within all of us? And then you have like kind of the industrial period, the industrial revolution, right? Where you again have kind of this same issue, right? Like you have an extreme level of externality in the sense that all the spoils, all the stuff that you generate just again flows to a very minute group of people, factory owners, and you have a lot of ideology that manifests because of it. And you again have to deal with that and find solutions to these issues. So if I want to give a theme of the 20th century, it's like how to deal with like inequality in a weird way, in the most extreme ways possible. And so to redefine like communism, which was like, yeah, well, let's make everyone like economically completely equal with the numbers, and the fascist
Which,
idea,
by the way, does not work.
I mean, it's a value, right? Like completely eliminating.
It's a value, but you also have to think of the practical aspect.
Exactly. And that's nothing more than saying, well, that also has externalities, right? Because, well, the people in the Soviet Union just suffered, right? There was people were shot in the streets. There was secret police everywhere. That's not a life worth living, right? And the same thing for fascism. I don't even have to start talking about why that's wrong.
My view on communism and my problem with it, my main one, is that, and you might argue against it, but I believe the government takes the place of the divine after a specific point, which I find deeply flawed in the practical sense and the effects it has. And we have seen it in societies manifest.
I think you put it very well. It becomes the God ruler, right? It's the ideology that becomes God itself. In fascism, you've got like a demagogue, right, that rules from the top. But yeah, in communism, it's the ideology, and therefore, like in communism, all the leaders just die constantly in coups, right? Because well, you're just a servant, ultimately. Wink, wink. So yeah. But I mean, ultimately, communism is a very attractive choice as well, right? And we have to be,
especially to young people, and on the extreme liberal side, it appears very attractive, and especially lately.
yeah, we have to kind of understand. We don't have to, but I think it's a very positive perspective to say that, well, it's a solution to the idea, like to the problem of inequality, right? It's the most extreme solution, right? Like, let's force everybody to share. But well, does it really create a positive world ultimately? But that takes perspective as well, right? Like, I have to be able to see subconsciously what that also creates, and not just stop at, well, I don't have money. Guy over there has money. He didn't do anything for it. That's unfair. Let's destroy the unfairness. And that's not really short-sighted, but again, it doesn't integrate the externalities that it creates ultimately. And so, yeah, just be open and talk to these people and try to show them why this actually happens, because they will always follow their dream, right? They will always have that feeling of needing to change something if it's still an issue, right? That's like, people just don't run around in the streets waving red flags if it's not a thing, right?
I have had the conversation regarding the economical system plenty of times, and every time I come into contact from anybody with the idea of the transfer of wealth,
Mhm.
I have to acknowledge the naivety
Mhm.
of that which it is.
Can I give you a very, very positive spin of the idea?
Yeah.
I think we've established beforehand that if emotions become super extreme, they kind of take over our psyche. And the same happens with greed. Greed is like a response that if you're kind of defenseless and can't really like take action, right? Optionality, you want to accumulate, right? I want to defend my position and I have to have more so that I'm feeling secure. And if that feeling manifests in society, boom, right? That's what's happening in the US right now. Because at the low end, you've got people dying in the streets of fentanyl overdoses. And on the high end, people are drinking champagne and fucking like having harems with like 20 young girls or something.
And cocaine.
So that has already manifested, right? And so
I would, in my eyes, the homeless person doing fentanyl would be at the same level of power as the person doing cocaine in the top floor penthouse with 119-year-olds on his yacht every single Saturday. And it goes back to, I think it was Seneca who said it, that all evil springs from weakness. And Nietzsche made a very good point on that too, which is that true power is not solely the ability to have influence.
Yeah.
True power is to not have unresolved needs, which will pull you away from your trajectory and your true center as a human being. And also, I do believe evil is a problem of weakness.
that's the banality of it, right?
Yeah.
It's like government bureaucrats trying to have a career to improve the living conditions of his family and becoming the biggest mass murderer, or like one of the biggest mass murderers in existence. That's the benevolence of it. Just don't care. You're emotionally blind because you've got no balance, right? You're just feeling the emotion of, I have to accumulate, I have to protect myself while I'm in a killing spree. And I just see the numbers of like people exterminated in the most gruesome situations possible.
The thing with having money as your god is that you are laying your foundations on something tangible that can be destroyed in any minute. Even with real estate, which is supposed to be the safest form of investment, how many real estate millionaires completely lost all their money in the Ukraine war?
Yeah.
Within less than 24 hours. How many markets have been wiped out within a single night? What do? If you put all your value into something so easily fragile,
Mhm.
let's say, what do you do when the storm happens? And it's also a biblical
Yeah,
story
yeah,
of the person who made the home on the sand and the person who made the home on the rocks. And then the storm came, and the person who built the home with fragile foundations lost.
mhm.
The person who built his foundations in the rocks.
One, yeah. I mean, then we're gonna get tasked a lot. Like, we're gonna have to have a lot of and create a lot of tough choices in the next years, because I mean the system is so broken that it's like I'm not seeing willingness to reform. Like the emotion has become so rampant, and you can see it in the US, right? There's no willingness to even deal with the inequality. It's not apparent to these people. But if you run a billionaires club and you're not in San Francisco and you're not willing to even see, right? If you like tell yourself, well, they are just schmucks that are just addicted, right? Again, back to the free will question, right? There is a circumstance that brought them there. Right? Like they didn't choose. Or would you want to choose to be a fentanyl dependent person? No, fuck no. Nobody wants that. But they're addicted for the rest of their lives because they got one time in their absolute craving for bliss and happiness came into contact with that drug.
Being addicted is something that potentially does not fall under the umbrella of free will, but the action of taking fentanyl does.
Have you ever been addicted to something and felt like the
Everybody
absolute?
has been addicted.
Have you been like addicted to like some sort of substance?
No.
I haven't, um, but I know people that have, and they explain to me the craving is abysmal. Like it just ruins your brain. And if you don't have help from outside, it's nearly impossible to withdraw from like substance addictions. And these people are not being given any help. Right? Like you heard Elon, right, saying empathy is a weakness. You have to have empathy because you can't see these social systems like wholly and like totally understand why they fail if you can't choose a different perspective. Like that's an intellectual operation. You are missing an intellectual operation that you need to have like a more accurate description of reality. Because you have to reduce your priors, you have to reduce your own emotional state that you might attribute to the world and feel it from the other person where his emotions are coming from. That's actually quite a complex operation. It's not simple. That's not trivial. Not in the slightest. And yeah, the US is deeply, deeply hurt by that. But there's no willingness to tax anybody or like to redistribute assets, for example. Nobody's willing to bust the housing crisis because, well, so much money is attached to it and people don't want to lose that worthness, right? Like that value that they have accumulated and like hoarding for like crazy till the end of their lives because I need security. But they're fucking idiots, right? Like, I don't know, why do you need like $1 billion when you're 80? That's crazy. Like, why? What value do you see in that? These people are so stuck in that single modus operandi in their emotion, they can't even break out of that. And this is like the curse of the old, right? You can't, when your brain, and they're going back into the science, crystallizes that much, and you're just constantly using that single emotion, it gives you all the pleasure and all the meaning in your life. You're not going to change, or not likely, rather, right? There's not going to be a cultural revolution where you're just like constantly, instantly convinced, yeah, I have to give up my wealth willingly. It's not going to happen. It's not likely. And so, yeah, and that's why revolutions happen ultimately, right? Like, which seems pretty much like a necessity now in the US. Like the current administration feels not. Trump got elected by people who are really suffering constantly, and instead of actually like, there's so much research out there why that happens, why revolutions happen, like internal civil wars happen. It's 90% of the time it's internal struggles because of internal inequality, because people feel materially completely subjugated. And let's be real here, like if you're living in paycheck to paycheck as a person, like you are in slavery to that company. If you cannot miss a paycheck, you can't be looking for a new job because you don't have any time. You're like completely saturated with work. You don't have any time to think. You don't have time to be anywhere. Ultimately, you're a slave. Or you're, yeah. And so this is a form of modern slavery. And yeah, we have to be truly honest about that. This is not a full, agentic, conscious human experience if you're doing that. So yeah, that's like one of the issues we have to solve on a society-wide level. But I'm hopeful for Europe in that regard because we kind of get that.
How much do you attribute? How much of that do you attribute to the elimination of God and the divine from the society?
I mean, the current the current ruling class claims it like itself to be very like God-fearing group.
You need a moral compass to guide you. At least this is my opinion.
Yeah.
And you definitely need a moral compass to guide you.
Mhm.
And you have to find that moral compass. And you can use the Christian one, which is based on the teachings of Jesus. You can choose the capitalistic one, which focuses entirely on the accumulation of physical assets. You can choose whichever moral compass resonates with you, and then you can bring up the argument that you do not do that based on free will, but based on your experiences or nature, and there is a conversation to happen there.